Hello everybody and welcome to the sixth video in our series of videos on the plantations. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know the three types of planters and the conditions they had to accept. Second, you guys should know the layout of the plantation towns, and finally you guys should know how and why the plantation was successful. Last time we saw how the rebellious Gaelic lords of Ulster rose in rebellion against Queen Elizabeth, only to suffer a devastating defeat at KINSALE in the 9 Years' War. We saw how they were given lenient terms in the Treaty of MELLIFONT, as the Queen had died and been replaced by her cousin James I. And finally we saw how these Gaelic lords, or the Earls of Ulster, left in 1607 in an event known as the Flight of the Earls, to try to get help in Europe to resist James I's policy of persecuting Catholics. Now, prior to the Flight of the Earls, something was happening that was a worry to the Gaelic lords and really an example to King James I. After the Treaty of MELLIFONT, hundreds of Scots and English began to cross the Irish Sea to start a new life in East Ulster, or modern-day Antrim and Down, which had been devastated by the recent rebellions. These counties were planted as part of a private plantation, and that means a plantation that was not funded by the Crown but instead funded by private individuals. In this case, the private individuals were Lord Hugh Montgomery and Lord James Hamilton. They were men responsible for organising this private plantation. It was actually a major success, and one of the reasons for this was because they brought lowland Scottish tenant farmers and their families to plant these new lands. And these tenant farmers were used to living in very similar damp conditions, and they were used to living off subsistence farming, as opposed to the undertakers of Munster, who were not used to living on small plots. The government, under the orders of James I, sponsored the plantation of the first 6 counties of Ulster: Armagh, Cavan, Derry, Donegal, Fermanagh and Tyrone. A commission of inquiry was set up, and they sent surveyors, who were protected by soldiers, to survey the land and determine that there was roughly about 4 million of acres available for planting. The land was divided into Crown land, which belonged to the king, and church land, which belonged to the Protestant Church of Ireland, which was the equivalent of the Anglican Church. The Church of Ireland got roughly 16% of all the land that was divided up, and Trinity College was also part of the church land, and that was given 3%. The Crown land was divided into estates of 1,000, 1,500 and 2,000 acres. And under the Articles of Plantations, which set up the rules of the plantation, these estates were to be given to 3 different types of people: undertakers, servitors and loyal Irish. So who were these people? Well, the undertakers were English and Scottish planters brought over to Ulster. One of the conditions of them receiving land was that they couldn't have any Gaelic Irish tenants, but their rent was kept cheap, and they only had to pay £5.33 per 1,000 acres. They also rented the vast majority of the land, getting 36% of all the land. The servitors were the next group, and these were English soldiers and officials who were owed money, and a lot of money, after defeating the Earls of Ulster in the 9 Years' War, and they were given land as part of a payment. They did pay a higher rent than the undertakers of around £8 per 1,000 acres, but they were allowed to keep Irish tenants. They were given the smallest group and took around 12% of the land. The third and final group were the loyal Gaelic Irish. These men were given the worst of land and settled near servitors in case they rebelled. They were the Gaelic Irish who hadn't joined in O'Neill and O'Donnell's 9 Year War, but still not massively trusted. They paid the largest rent, roughly £10.46 per 1,000 acres, And they were also allowed to have Irish tenants, which many people will be surprised by, but they were expected to keep these Irish under control. And the loyal Irish got about 20% of the land of the plantation. Now, all these groups had to meet other conditions. If you had 1,000 acres of land, you had to build a bawn, and this was for defensive purposes if there was another rebellion. A bawn was a stone wall around an enclosure. If you had 1,500 acres, you had to build a bawn and a stone house. And with 2,000 acres, you had to build a bawn and a defensive tower or a stone castle. At first, not many undertakers came forward, so James I persuaded a group of 12 London guilds to undertake the plantation of the whole of County Derry, which was roughly 10% of all the land of that 4 million acres. This group, known as the Irish Society, was to take land on the same terms as the Undertakers and to build 2 fortified cities at Coolraine and at Derry, or Londonderry, which had been a fort established by Mountjoy's men during the 9 Years' War. The town of Derry, or Londonderry, was the last walled town to be built in Western Europe. Over 20 new towns were planned and built with stone walls around them. They were generally laid out with wide, straight streets with a central square or diamond where the courthouse or church would have been built and where markets were also held. These towns became centres for trade and administration like courts and jails. Over the years, many of the Gaelic Irish came to live outside the walls of these towns, and these suburbs were usually called Irishtown. Now, some Gaelic Irish refused to become tenants on these new plantations, and they took to the mountains and woods to become known as Tories or outlaws, who would attack new planters. However, the plantation turned out to be massively successful. First of all, it increased the influence of the English customs and laws, as well as language and farming methods. It spread the Protestant religion, both Presbyterian religion and the Anglican religion, and also it helped to ensure a loyal population. The results of the plantation were significant. So unlike the Munster plantation, the Undertakers actually stuck around, and by 1640 there were roughly 40,000 Scottish and English settlers in Ulster, and this dramatically changed the landscape of what had up until now been the stronghold of the Gaelic Irish. However, this was not to be the last chapter in the story of the English colonisation of Ireland, as there was another particularly bloody chapter left when Oliver Cromwell came to Ireland in 1649. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you guys should know the 3 main types of planters and the conditions they had to accept. You guys should know the layout of the plantation towns. And finally, you guys should know how and why the plantation was successful. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.